to 775 Alive, where we're going to be looking at world, national, state, and local issues from the perspective of rural Nevada. I'm Scott Gavorski.
And I'm Crystal Newton.
We wanted to come to you today and do a little hot take on one of the big news stories that's going on nationally right now, which is, of course, the rioting we've seen breaking out over the last week.
They're fighting in the streets.
Fighting in the streets. Don't want to call it a riot.
They say it's protesting.
Okay.
Do you consider it protesting?
Potentially.
You know how I felt about the Carson City.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, those aren't real. They're not like really representing our First Amendment rights from the citizen perspective. But here we are again. This was 2020, the summer of burning down cities. Here we are again. So I just don't know what these things are. Do they look fundamentally different to you?
I think there are some differences. I do think they are following a pattern we saw in the 2020 Summer of Love protest. But I think one of the big differences is I do think there are some legitimate concerns here in these protests. But I do think there's also an aspect, and the difference I see is a lot of the attention in these protests seems to be directed directly against government facilities, government employees, government buildings, much more than we've seen in last protest or in other protests. I know we had the Waymo car sort of burned.
Oh my gosh, people are ordering Waymos.
You're
Which
right.
are these driverless cars, and they arrive and they burn them down. I don't know whether I'm trying not to laugh.
No, I think laughing's it's an interesting dimension to these protests. But I do think in some ways that's not a rage issue in the sense that it's an organic rage. I think it is manufactured to some extent. Not saying that a lot of people don't have problems with the policies that sparked these protests, which of course there was an raid, it appears now, on a business that was being investigated not only for involvement in illegal smuggling or illegal human smuggling or human trafficking, I guess we could more correctly say. And it was also involved, apparently, or allegedly, in money laundering back to the cartels. So you have what in some ways is a legitimate ICE raid. Now, this was also in conjunction with some ICE raids. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, keeps talking about the 4-year-olds. You had ICE show up at these elementary school graduations, knowing that parents that they were looking for. And again, it looks like a lot of these were parents that not only so much that they were illegal, but they were illegal criminals that are on a list to be deported because of their criminality. And they went into this elementary school and started arresting these people.
We see the Democrats kind of mischaracterizing these. Like the last one was the Maryland father, the T-ball coach, happened to have been picked up for human trafficking
In Tennessee.
Yeah, and there was a domestic abuse a couple of times. And there was one other thing, I think, he's had his due process. We have the evidence.
Well,
but he was a Maryland father.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so sad. Just these 4-year-olds are being picked up. I'm like, would you stop cherry picking?
I think, cherry picking might be a good way. I think there's also efforts to control the narrative. And that, I think, is one of the things that's been so important here in understanding these protests is that both sides jump on very early on in an effort to characterize these protests. So it starts out, these are peaceful until President Trump sends in the National Guard without the governor's request and or permission. Of course, it's questionable to what extent permission might be required, right?
Mm-hmm.
Government request. But at the same time, you also have, there's definite sort of acts going on here, right? The gentleman who was throwing rocks at vehicles, federal vehicles, the shutdown on the 101 highway, these sorts of issues. And I think part of the problem that I see is that it's one thing, it's really hard to determine in my mind somebody's motive to protest. And that's where I think getting paid versus First Amendment rights becomes blurry, because how do you determine that in the moment? Now, you can potentially afterwards, but in the moment, how do you delegitimate a protest without knowing with certainty when everybody's there?
That's the big legal question right now, and how you define these things, and why I keep bringing it up is there is the nature of the citizen who has a guaranteed right to defend their rights, and most of that is through the First Amendment. And there is a spirit of the law there that is basically says you can do these things, you can assemble and protest as long as this is you truly representing your rights. But we start to get into this weird territory where we have outside organizations paying people to show up and air quote protest for their rights. And I'm like, okay, they're being paid to protest. And then on the other side, you've got a political party that is actively trying to stop anyone from intervening in violence. So I'm like, this starts to look like so we need to get to the definition of insurrection to justify Trump's actions of sending in military. And I'm like, we're really struggling with defining these activities because it's not clear-cut First Amendment rights being exercised here. This is starting to look more like a commercial operation. And to what end? Is it to insurrect our country and our laws?
There's a lot.
That's the question. I'm not trying to argue necessarily, but I'm like, these are the questions we have to answer right now.
And I actually think the problem is that's 3, 4, 5 questions that need to be answered. So first,
I do have more than 5,
right?
But we'll stick with the
so 5. Yeah, and that's fine. I think a lot of people have questions, and that's one of the things we want to explore here. But my point is that freedom of speech stops when actions become damaging to the rights of others. So in this case, somebody standing outside.
Same rule with hate speech. Very similar. Like you can have free speech up until a certain point.
But no, my argument is that in this case, it's actions. So somebody standing with the sign opposing ICE, standing outside the facility, that in my mind is clearly a 100% First Amendment issue.
Okay.
Standing in front of the gate and actively trying to block federal troops entering a federal facility or federal personnel entering a federal facility, that's something different.
Yeah.
And certainly throwing rocks at moving vehicles, ordering and burning Waymo cars.
I'm not sure that has anything to do with anything. I think they're just like, hey, let's burn something.
I think it does. But what it is, it's not protected First Amendment speech.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a clear action that's going on here that's damaging and potentially impacting the rights of others, and somebody standing with a sign and protesting is not. And so my issue number one is, even before you get into the motives of the protesters, I think there's clear groups that can be drawn.
Yeah.
Is my point. But we don't even have to get into the commercialized, the professional protester, as you put it. Although there's some of that going on, but even if they were paid just to sit there and hold a sign, that's a legitimate expression of the First Amendment. There's no way to determine at the time of the protest that somehow, okay, your sign that says deporting illegal aliens is free speech, but you over here, that somebody paid for your lunch to hold that sign, you can't be here. That's just too messy, I think, and not really worthwhile even pursuing from a legal standpoint. But the passage into action, I think, is really the key dynamic here. And I would argue this is one of the things that's separating these protests from what we saw. You and I were talking a little bit just generally as this event unfolded about the 92 Rodney King riot.
Yeah.
And in that case, we had far less direct aiming at sort of institutions of government power than we saw with either the Summer of Love protest, the George Floyd protest in 2020, or we're seeing now. And I think that marks a distinction that might be interesting.
No, the Rodney King riots, I was a little too young to really be paying attention at the time. And I was asking you earlier today just how it looked to you, how differently it looked as compared to George Floyd and some of these. And you were telling me that the Rodney King ones were much more violent.
I think, no.
And I was like, I guess I wanted to say, though, I was surprised that this race thing has flared up before. Because the way they posture it and seat it right now, it's as if racism came back out of nowhere and it's like fully like, blah. And I'm like, we've been touching on this issue off and on for decades, haven't we? It's just come and go.
Oh, race riots in the U.S. history go all the way back to before the Civil War. That in itself is nothing new. The comparison.
I'm just wondering what makes it inflame and what makes it drop down. There's got to be something instigating it.
And I think that's where we're seeing a couple different distinctions. So in the Rodney King riots back in '92, it was clearly discontent among an African American community there that really was facing a Los Angeles Police Department that I think a lot of people now viewed as having some serious issues.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was necessarily more violent. I think the violence was directed in a different direction. So there was a lot of personal violence. Reginald Denny, I think, was the truck driver who gets dragged out
Yeah.
at the start of the riot out of his semi-truck and kicked severely. That's also where one of the other images you're seeing coming out.
And that was a white person.
Yeah, presumably he was a white truck driver. But you also had, in a sense, that's where the image we have now, because one of the things is that there had also been tensions in Los Angeles between the African American and South Korean immigrant communities. And these potentially, the fear was these would spread into looting and attacks against the South Korean communities. And that's where we had the image where the South Korean community organized itself. And these images of the South Koreans on the roof of South Korean-owned businesses with rifles, clearly aiming to keep looters or potential rioters away from their property, gets embedded. And you're seeing that sort of play out now. But what I don't recall, and I'll be happy to go back and look at this a little bit more in depth if I am wrong, but it seemed to me during the Rodney King riots, this was much more traditional rioting when a community was involved and they were lashing out against a lot of targets. One of the things I think we've seen in the George Floyd riots, and this might get to your concern with this professionalization of protesting, was that in a lot of cases, there was very clear efforts to aim at symbols of government power, that is, attack police stations, burn down police stations, burn down representatives of the new order, maybe some of that in a Waymo thing as well. This is a lashing out against supposedly commercialism and capitalism. In that case, I think there has been a change in the rioting. I've got friends that have defended the Summer of Love in part. Yes, they do damage, but they did damage to their own communities. And in this way, it's not much different than the rioting we saw in Watts or Detroit back in the 60s, that we saw in other race riots earlier. I think there is actually a difference in kind now. I think they're much more targeted with the explicit intent not to address an injustice to that particular community, but to address a change, not just in government policy, but I think increasingly it's about addressing a change in at least the personnel in government, delegitimizing a president, delegitimizing a political party, what have you. I think that has emerged as a much stronger dynamic here in these protests than we saw earlier. You're laughing at me.
I am. You always have the most textbook worthy answer for these things, and I always have the most cynical explanation, right? So at the heart of it, what I see when I look at this, I see a Democratic Party that is utterly lost, and their followers have every right to be outraged with them, with what happened in this last election cycle. And instead of taking on that outrage, they're redirecting it. I see this as the National Party hiring a bunch of people to get them stoked and turning that outrage towards something else other than them. Because you'll notice there's not a lot of Democratic pundits they'll touch on it like, oh, we could have done better here or here. I'm like, you utterly and totally failed your people. The Democratic Party did. And I'm like, this would be my tactic. Let's get protests going. Let's get them angry. Let's get them outward facing so that we don't have to get any kind of a backlash from this. And I think that's really the fundamental explanation here is they're going to stoke fires everywhere so that's not turned on them.
Yeah, let's break that down, because the first thing I want to say is I don't think there's any evidence that like the DNC has been directly involved.
Of course not.
Right.
Of course not.
But not even not being cynical. I think
They
you
send
are
out to PACs, and then PACs send it out to here, and then it filters through. Of course, they're not going to have return receipts.
But I think we'll have to see how that goes. I do think you're right on the sense, though, that how Democratic politicians in California have been presenting this does represent an effort to deflect blame. One of the problems is LA is still hurting from those fires.
Yeah.
And not to mention the ongoing problems with homelessness and crime and whatnot that's really been the result now of eight years of intensive sort of left-wing Democrat administration. And I think that's problematic. And the fact that the one thing that to me indicates this might not be necessarily an organized protest, even though we're starting to see some follow-up protests, those have been much slower to develop than what we saw in the Summer of Love, where everything flares up across the country within a weekend. It's really only been the last couple of days we've started to see companion protests pop up in other cities. And that in some ways indicates to me that at least the origin of the Los Angeles riots might have actually been started within the Los Angeles community. Now,
Sure.
that doesn't mean there's outside groups, but this seems really odd to spur this up just in Los Angeles and let it slowly spread as opposed to. And of course, they've got the big.
We've been organizing them all over the country. We've even had some protests in Elko for crying out loud. But
well, we have the new King protest coming. No King's protest, excuse me. No King's protest coming up June 14th. It's Trump's birthday. It's also the military parade because it happens to be the 250th birthday of the formation of the U.S. Army, the Continental Army. And I think that's coming. Those protests have long been organized, and I'm not expecting anything. Whatever's going to happen in Elko, it's not going to look like LA.
Yeah.
It's just not.
I look at their side, and when you look at Democratic policies in Democratic cities, it's difficult to blame your quality of life and your problems directly on a government, but you just feel it more in a liberal city, and there's a little bit more of that anger built up and passive aggressiveness that's ready to be tapped in at all times. And again, I'm the cynical one here. I want to point back to, I think the Democratic Party is using that energy and turning it outwards. And even from the city and county level, like, your policies can only take you so far before people start getting hurt. And you've got to turn that energy somewhere. And it's so much easier to blame it on others. But you notice these things typically happen in liberal cities where those policies are the most egregious.
Right.
So that pent up energy is there. It's seated there. And the Democratic Party knows this. So if they didn't turn the energy this way, they'd be taking it on themselves.
And that's it. Cynical as that might be, I think that is a very common read on a lot of these issues.
You think?
Yeah, I don't think there's much dispute there. What I think has been shocking, we've had a lot of language back and forth on both sides about arresting politicians. And again, this has been a door I think really Democrats have opened and are starting to regret that.
Yeah, we impeach people for everything now. Impeach him!
Yeah, but it's not just impeachment. And
he used Kleenex that wasn't organic. Impeach him!
Well, but that, I don't know if it's gotten that severe, but
It'll get there. Just give it some time.
I think one of the things that we've seen with this also, and there's a question on whether the president has the authority to deploy a National Guard over governors.
That is the critical question I wanted to discuss with you today.
Okay.
And
now that we're a half hour into the show.
The big difference, that National Guard has been deployed before, but the thing Democrats are up in arms about this time is Trump didn't consult Newsom. And I think that's an unfair statement, just because we've seen this in 2020. We've seen that Democratic governors will not step in, and we're not going to have another summer of cities getting burned down. So we're stopping it right now. Right. We're sending him in because we already know what Newsom's reaction is going to be. We already know. It's not like he just went in and I'm not even going to talk to the governor. It's like, I know exactly what he's going to do. He's demonstrated to me what he does in this situation. So I think Trump was in the right. He's like, diplomacy has been exhausted with these governors. If you're going to allow protesting, you're going to get the National Guard, period. And
of course, just the devil's advocate side is that Trump's just looking for an excuse to use military force. So there's two components to it, though. So first, he calls in the National Guard. I do think there is a title in U.S. Code, Title 10, that justifies this. And there's part of the problem is there's a couple different definitions. One seems to imply that only in conjunction with the governor. The other implies, and we've seen this, the National Guard can be deployed over the objections of a governor. Yep. And we saw that quite a bit, back in the 60s against the Civil Rights Movement. George Wallace in Alabama refuses to integrate the schools, and LBJ sends in the National Guard. We have that sort of thing. We've also seen the use of the regular military. And that's an important distinction that's being drawn because just here, I guess today. Just brought in the Marines. Yeah, that's the part that kind of, that made me give some pause. I'm like, the Marines that's the real military. It's the real military. So, no offense I love our National Guard. That came off. I love our National Guard. But I'm like, Marines are a serious thing to call into a city. But you had that Maxine Waters, who gets involved in this very early on. That's part of what she's hinting out. Geez, these people actually have guns. Yeah. So do the police. But yeah, I think there is a thing. But the thing they're referring to, National Guard usually has rubber bullets and like mace type of like tear gas type of things. But the Marines, they have the real bullets. but the bullets can be changed out. Yeah. I think one of the first thing about this is the Marines aren't actually being used for crowd control. Trump's order sent them to guard actual federal property. which is another interesting legal thing because federal property is federal property. We live in a society that recognizes property rights, like it or not. And there probably is a good justification for using federal military troops to guard federal assets from damage.
Sure.
And I think that's an issue that Trump might actually be on a little bit more clearer legal basis than they think.
Maybe. I think typically you'd use the National Guard, but
you could. I think the two problems is, one, he's not sure if the National Guard might not. I think it would survive in court. I don't see why it wouldn't. But there's always the possibility. But I think more importantly is it sends a clear statement. Look, I got the California National Guard out here to quell the riots, but we're not going to accept the destruction of federal property. If you want to go burn down LA's City Hall, that's between Karen Bass and you.
Yeah.
But burning down the federal property is a line we're not going to accept. And again, I think that's a legal.
It's reasonable.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable legal argument that they're making. The other thing I wanted to point out, though, is that we're not dealing with the same military that we were dealing with back after World War II. The truth is the American military, and I'll use the term professionalized military for Marines and Army as opposed to the National Guard. Again, no disrespect. But we've got an Army that's basically, our military that's had to spend 20 years, the Afghan war, Iraq war, other deployments, basically dealing with more or less this type of civil unrest. So I don't think this is a military that might live in the minds of the Vietnam generation that's kill them all and let God out sort of mentality. I think it's a much different military that actually has much more experience with exactly these type of things and keeping them under control.
Yeah.
That's probably why we're seeing such a small number of Marines deployed. I haven't looked into it, but it wouldn't surprise me that we have Marines that are coming from units that have served this type of civil unrest mission in the past, and presumably can keep this under control far better than most people, particularly in the media, are willing to give them credit for.
Yeah, and you're right, using the term professionalism, not just in the way that you've used it, but I don't know how many people understand that our military is incredible. One of the reasons it's incredible is it abides by ethical and moral codes that have been agreed upon in war. Like, we follow rules. And when we're in a foreign country, we follow procedure. And I wouldn't say the same for most other countries' militaries. It's just, we're at war. Like, we're going to do whatever's necessary. But our troops know the law.
Right.
They're diplomatic. They're trained to be that way.
Not diplomacy, at least de-escalation techniques, which I think are much more vital here.
I think most of our troops have spent the last 20 years in Arabic culture. They're particularly diplomatic. Like, they know what's acceptable in that culture and what's not. I've noticed a lot of Marines from Iraq and Afghanistan, they come back with a lot more empathy when they speak. They're very critical. They listen to what they're saying. Notice that from that group.
And the question is, how might some of that transfer over to a domestic situation? Now, the argument is they shouldn't be used at all. The arguments around posse comitatus. Again, I think Trump is actually on a stronger legal ground if they really are constrained to guarding federal property.
Yeah, the legal ground is intact. I think the military is actually better because they've learned how to stay cool under extraordinary fire. And I'd say the same of law enforcement, but law enforcement doesn't typically encounter an entire mob of people, which is more like what you'd find in a wartime setting. So in some ways, that group is they're a lot more trained to be very cool in a situation like that, where I think law enforcement would be cool, but I think they would not be as confident, because that would be really scary. You don't see that every day. You're used to traffic stops, you're used to talking to bums. Like, there's a lot. Sorry, that wasn't politically correct. Right. The homeless population. What is the word we use now?
No, homeless population more.
Persons without, the unhoused persons. I haven't kept up with the vernacular. But the typical thing a law enforcement officer goes through, this is not typical for them. So I would almost argue the military is a better fit for this.
Except I imagine we have I imagine what officers are left in a lot of these services. A lot of them were veterans of the summer.
That's true.
And have gone through these increased emphasis on de-escalation techniques. I think if they're unsure of anything, they're unsure of how much political backing they have. I think you saw that yesterday in the LA police chief's one of his press where he's, regardless of what's being said by the politicians, from the view here, commanding the LA Police Department, this violence has gotten out of control. We are no longer able to contain this. And this is,
I think once you hit the word violence, it's out of control. And you made a great distinction earlier that there's a difference between protesting with a sign and starting to commit crimes. Right. That'd be the easier way to say it. It's like, the minute you're committing a crime while protesting, the protesting doesn't get your butt off the hook. I almost said a bad word. Sorry. We
No,
could have
no,
used
no.
the bleep feature.
We can use the bleep feature.
Like, you're not off the hook. If you're protesting, it does not excuse criminal behavior, period.
No, except I do think there is some gray area there that you might be missing.
Okay.
So technically, trespassing is.
I am a tyrant. I'll let you take it back to a civilized code.
Trespassing is technically a criminal activity. I'm not sure protesters who go onto a federal facility and don't block the access or don't block operations and just have their signs.
Yeah, you can't impede an operation of law enforcement. You can't burn things down. You can't trespass.
Right.
There's a whole list of things. These are criminal things. You can't do these things.
Well, but what I'm saying is there's a difference between trespassing and throwing a rock with an intent to cause a vehicle to crash and burning a vehicle. Those are three different crimes. They're all crimes. The trespassing one in the pursuit of First Amendment rights, I think there really probably should be some leeway given in how government. In fact, a de-escalation technique might actually be letting them trespass and not saying anything. Let them blurt it out. The other two you can't accept. You can't just say, "Oh, burn the building. We'll spend another $58 million rebuilding this," because you're upset about something. That gets into a whole different thing. And certainly when you get into the impact, we saw this with the Kyle Rittenhouse issue. This sounds weird. The whole thing is Kyle Rittenhouse, whatever one thinks about he does, and be the first to argue he should have never been involved and should have never been there. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there were people trying to cause him severe physical harm. And they openly admitted that. And you can't say, okay, because this went badly for the people who wanted to cause somebody else harm, there's no crime. You can't say that. And that I think is one of the confusions we have that's going on from the Summer of Love riots.
It's not just the criminal aspect. There's something, the Summer of Love, yes, the violent part of it was really upsetting. But me as a business person, and you were just talking as just a regular private individual about our insurance rates going up and up. The Summer of Love, there was somewhere between $4 and $5 billion worth of insurance claims filed. You can be 100% sure that's not the total amount of damage. There was plenty of people that were uninsured or just didn't bother to file like I would have done with my business, because the moment I claim anything on my insurance goes through the roof. So when you start to talk about the damage being done, it is a cost to all of us. All of our insurance goes up. All our taxes don't go as far. Like, these things cause real damage and they need to be stopped. Like, we lost billions of dollars during 2020 to this nonsense. So I am 100% behind Trump. I wish there was more legal clarity, but whatever you need to do to stop these things right now, I don't want to see this the whole summer. And I certainly don't want to have to keep paying higher insurance rates and have to go through all the rigmarole because somebody had to vent by burning down a building. It's absurd. It cannot be acceptable. It just can't.
And I think that's, again, going back, I think that's really a big change we saw. And of course, going back, there were some buildings burned by Rodney King, nothing significant that I seem to recall. But certainly when you looked at Detroit in 67, Watts riots back in the 60s, yeah, there was a lot of building damage, that's associated with this. But a lot of these were actually buildings that were constrained largely to the area of town in which the aggrieved community lived. And in some cases, these buildings were, slumlord rat traps that they burned down, and probably in the long run, that was for the best. But at the same time, I think we have a weird dynamic where we almost seem to be arguing that it's the viable way for populations that can't get their grievances heard is to take out violence because we can rebuild it, and somehow rebuilding the damage done from the riots is cheaper and somehow better for society than just solving the damn problem to begin with.
Well, I can guarantee you the people that are burning down cities are probably not people who pay the taxes. And so because they have no stake in it, it's nothing to them. They're like, endless amounts of tax dollars, they'll just rebuild it. Screw you guys.
And in a city that's already struggling to rebuild after the fires. That's, I think, going to be an interesting long-term aspect of these riots. Is that how this features into, I can't think of any other word to characterize both the city of LA and the state of California's response to those Palisades fires than utter failure. I mean, There's since the fires happened, they were going to fast track reconstruction, and there seems to be one house that's been rebuilt, and the guy just happened to have a building permit pretty much already done when the fires broke out, so he just repurposed it. Yeah,
and I wish it was a failure, and I wish it was incompetence, but I don't think that's the case. I think blue states have figured out you can fail all day long, and the federal government will bail you out. I think that's what they figured out. So it makes me outraged. It's not just a failure. This was on purpose.
There's a difference between failure and
California's going to tank this country if we don't stop this.
I think you're absolutely right. And I don't think it's a coincidence that
free health care to immigrants, and then like, oops, we're $3 billion short. Let's apply to the federal government to bail us out. Excuse me?
$3 billion.
Why don't you go and be your own country? Just go away.
Yeah, and I think this is a problem when you have...
I'm so mad right now. I'm sorry, California.
No, that's okay. Yeah, but this is a legitimate concern, is you have Gavin Newsom's government that by all accounts, so what, he comes into the office with a $10 billion surplus. They're currently at a $20 billion deficit. So that's $30 billion that have been lost somehow in some of these policies.
That'll probably just get bailed out by the federal government. Like this.
And that's going to be an interesting take. And a way to look at that is the old canard that the states are the laboratories of democracy. There were the experiments carried out. At some point, anybody doing experiments, anybody that has to be a scientist has to take a look at what they're doing and determine, like, this stream of inquiry is not going anywhere. It's a dead end. And in some ways, we might be at the point of reaching that in some of these experiments.
Yeah.
And the consequences of that might actually be quite dire.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking at California's weight and how big they are and how big their debt is. And my gosh, we've got to do something about that. We've got to stop the blue states from juicing the federal tax dollars like that. Somehow there's got to be a cap or something. I don't know.
There's a couple different ways. Part of it, again,
think of Nevada. How much emergency disaster relief money have we received from the federal government? How much have we been bailed out? Nothing. That means every person in the state of Nevada that pays federal taxes virtually just sent their money to California because they're incompetent.
We do get some.
Yeah, but not nearly what they get per capita.
That brings up an interesting example, is it's not just the fact that Nevada isn't getting those funds, but Nevada has not been finding itself in a situation to need those funds. So this is, again, going back to these fires, Nevada, just until the last couple of years, our area up here in the north has been subjected to heavy droughts, but we have not seen the extensive fire damage that supposedly these same droughts bring to California.
No, because we've got wonderful people tending to our lands here.
And I think that's an interesting part about it. And if you truly believe the idea of the states being the laboratories of democracy, there is a legitimate argument to be made. Why is California alone of these western states that are undergoing drought not seeing, or why is California alone seeing the extensive damage that seems to be going on with these fires?
Absolutely. Nevada has a clear-cut management of natural resources where we cut fire lines and we minimize how far they can get. California has every opportunity to clear out the brush from their forests, and they do not. And it causes these massive fires. That is complete mismanagement. And really the biggest difference, Nevada's assembly is one seat on each side away from being a one-party state. California is a one-party state.
Right.
Their assembly is run completely by Democrats. They have a supermajority. They pass everything that comes into their mind. And they're like having fun with it and running up the credit card bill. The only thing I can say to Nevada is please vote some more Republicans into our assembly, because once you give Democrats roughshod over the assembly, that's it. It's done. California is a disaster.
And I think just to bring this back to the question of what's going on in California now, that highlights, I think, an important missing component in a lot of the conversations, is that these are not new issues. Even ICE going in and raiding these people. There's a distinction, criminality versus non-criminality and this type of stuff. But one of the things to remember is that one of the reasons so many people seem to be favoring, and that's been the interesting dynamic, is that even as these riots have gone through, Trump's approval ratings on this subject have been positive. He holds slightly, at least, the upper hand.
And you also want to throw in, entire across the globe is trending towards conservative people being elected to power.
But I'm just talking this issue. He's still
I know,
underwater
I'm
and
just
everything
saying,
else.
There is a strong movement towards we need to back away from this nonsense.
We need to back away, I think, for the immigration issue. But my point was that this immigration policy is a direct response to policies that are also questionable when they put in the open border policies that we saw under the Biden administration.
Yeah.
And the constant argument, this isn't a problem. These really are desperate people. The border's secure, all this other stuff that I think a lot of people now are like, how did they ever think this was going to work? And
Alejandro Mayorkas.
Right.
You remember him? He was a gem.
Yeah.
The border is secure.
Right. And
we have a busy day Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on.
Yeah.
I'm so glad he's
Right.
not in office anymore.
The point is, what this illustrates is the problem where we have policies increasingly being set not by the legislative process where there's a debate between people with different opinions that are compromising and figuring this out. They're being set by these sort of ad hoc policies that swing wildly from one to the other. And I think that is a problematic dimension in all this. Is that I think for a long time there was an assumption that the American people don't really want to get involved in this sort of policy debates, and they were happy to let the people in Washington deal with it. I think part of what we're seeing is that that's not workable long term.
Oh, letting the fox in the hen house is not a good idea.
That's one way of looking at it. But and my beef is that a lot of our problems is Congress not doing its job.
Just think about this. Would you allow someone 2,000 miles away to manage your family? Someone who doesn't know you? Like, how do you even think that would work? You let someone 2,000 miles away, you give them your money and say, do the right thing for me.
Right.
Are you kidding me?
And this is an argument we're going to have over the next generation.
It really is. We need a smaller government. It's this. No, you need to be closer to your government.
And that the smaller government might be the best way to wrap this up.
City, state, those are your people.
You have the Democrats that half the time, in this case, claiming that the smaller government entities, that is the county of Los Angeles, or city of Los Angeles and the county, that they're capable of handling this, and Trump has misstepped by bringing in the feds. But there were plenty of cases where people on the other side of the coin said local authorities can deal with this much better than the feds 2,000 miles away in Washington can. So both of those sets of issues revolve around the same question: is who ultimately should be making the decisions?
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately what we're seeing, unfortunately, yet another violent confrontation in our society.
And that's interesting because I know California did sue the federal government Monday.
Right, about withdrawing the national guard.
It's based on a 10th Amendment argument of states' rights, but like we were delineating, like we're protecting federal buildings. That's not states' right. That's federal property. It is such a nuanced thing going on here.
Some people would argue it's not nuanced because remember one of the times that the federal government tried to use troops to defend federal property started the Civil War in the effort of Lincoln's administration to hold on to Fort Sumner.
Right. It was Fort Sumter.
Yeah, okay. Fort Sumter. Anyway,
somebody just accidentally lit a cannon. Oh crap!
Oh no! It's
that funny.
No,
whoops.
No, it was far more planned than that. But that being said, only 2 people died at Fort Sumter. And it was 2 Confederate soldiers the day after the surrender who overpacked a cannon and it blew up on them in the celebration.
They were fighting over a girl.
No, it was a celebration casualty.
Someone charging another one to a duel.
Yeah. No, I think this is a situation we ought to watch, but one that we just wanted to do a hot take here and discuss this while it's fresh. So go ahead and visit us at 775alive.com. If you have any questions, comments, want to correct my remembrances of the Rodney King riots, shoot us an email at info@775alive.com. Until then, I'm Scott Gavorski.
And I'm Crystal Newton.
We'll see you around the 775.